welcome to the fifth in our series of Major Project Association MPA Sustainability webinars. My name is Lucy Hill and I work in AECOM's Climate Change, Sustainability and Resilience team, and I'm AECOM's MPA Sustainability Ambassador, acting as chair today. This webinar on electric vehicles follows on from WSP's successful webinars presented last year and last week's webinar presented by Luke Aldred. Our previous Sustainability Ambassadors webinars are available on the MPA Knowledge Community YouTube channel, so please do check those out. Before we get started, I would like to point out a couple of things. For your information, you are muted and cameras are disabled, so please use the chat function for discussion or if you have any technical difficulties. There is a separate Q&A function, and we will have time at the end for questions, so please do ask your questions through that function at any time. Throughout the webinar, we will also be running a few polls to get your views. The first one is ready for you to answer now. What kind of vehicle do you own? There's also a second one that you can also answer as well. And Sally will discuss the answers to those within the webinar. So our presenter today is Sally Vivian. She's practice lead for climate change, sustainability and resilience at AECOM and has over 30 years of experience supporting clients to manage and improve environmental and sustainability performance. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Sally for the presentation on transitioning to electric vehicles, the hidden and social impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and welcome to everybody. I'm really looking forward to sharing some thoughts and knowledge and seeing at the end whether maybe it changes any of your practices. So got a couple of polls in the poll area, so really encourage you to complete those. The first, which you can find, to say, Lucy identified on the chat function. The first one is what type of vehicle do you own? For those of you who listened to the session that Luke ran last week, it is the same question again, but just wanted to pick up the additional attendees we might have this time. And then the second poll, what is the most important positive factor in your decision to buy an EV? So really hoping that you can sort of publish your thoughts here, and we'll come back and have a look at the polls at the end of the session. But what am I going to focus on today? What's the conversation? It's really about sharing some learning on a research project that we did, looking at the likely growth of mineral supply attributed to electric vehicles, and then having a look at spatial distribution and literature to see the impacts of those mineral supply chains, identify where the future growth in the mineral impacts might occur, and what would be the environmental and social impacts. And then finally, having a look at some of the existing interventions and controls and discussing possible additional measures. I think it's fair to say before we move on that what we're not saying in this is we're not talking about EV being a poor technology, far from it. It's absolutely what needs to happen from a low carbon solution. But I think it's really important to recognise it's a low carbon solution and it still has some environmental and social impacts, and is just an example of one of the many trade-offs we're likely to need to make as we transition to a low carbon economy. Clearly, also technology is going to evolve, and also some of the facts and growth assumptions that I'm using in this are pre-COVID. So we already talked, I think last week, Luke was discussing how COVID may change some of the take-up of EVs, may also mean that some of the facts and figures don't quite come as we're going to talk about. And also technology will evolve, and maybe we'll have another technology that doesn't use some of the minerals that we're going to talk about as well. So a lot of things are likely to change, but I think there are still going to be some fairly significant impacts that we're going to experience and cause as we go through the transition to EVs. So we're going to start by looking at the trends and drivers, and what do we think some of those are going to be. The key drivers for EV take-up, Paris Agreement, obviously Luke spoke about this last week, Climate Change Act in the UK with our net zero target by 2050, and specifically then the Road to Zero, the UK Road to Zero transport strategy, which has included a commitment for no new petrol or diesel cars to be sold in the UK from 2030. That's just 9 years' time. We're going to go from our current mix of ICE, internal combustion engine, and EVs through to no internal combustion vehicles being sold. It's going to be a big change. And then we'd probably predict that over the next decade, you'd have a transition to pretty much being very few petrol or diesel cars left on the road, as it tends to take about 10 years for car fleet to transition completely with technologies. So got a lot of things to do in 9 years, which Luke spoke about last week with infrastructure. But what's that mean for the supply chain and some of the new minerals that might be required in that? Forecast EV demand, to put some of these things in context. Global EV sales projected to increase considerably, as you can see from the diagrams on the slide on the screen. The left-hand chart is looking at EV sales versus ICE sales per year. And you can see that over the transition from now through to 2040, we're expecting globally for this EV to become the dominant technology being sold. Obviously, in certain countries like UK, even more dramatic change. But if you look at the graph on the right, that shows how that will gradually transition in terms of total cars on the road. So by 2040, might only be about a third. But nevertheless, that still could mean up to 30 million EVs on the road, compared to what's probably about 1 million at the moment. So some massive, massive change in what is basically a very new technology. And that means new technology, new batteries. And it's really the focus of the session today, is looking at some of the minerals that are driving through in those battery technologies. Yes, our existing internal combustion engine have batteries, but it's just for starting. And the lead acid battery we all have in our cars at the moment meet the low energy density, low cost, and relatively low levels of power demand. It's not going to work with EVs. They have some very important design considerations. So high energy density, lightweight, to create a greater level of energy to weight ratio. And that's particularly meant for EVs, a growth in nickel metal hydride technologies and lithium ion technologies. Nickel metal hydride was initially quite popular, but has also been constrained by a lower rate of charge and service life. And gradually, lithium ion is now being looked at as the current standard for modern EV batteries, as it's got the right combination of characteristics of high energy density and weight ratio. And as you'll see on the table on the slide, that cobalt is a key anode for lithium ion batteries, and cobalt for the lithium ion batteries for anode, and lithium for the cathode. And those are two really important minerals that we'll be looking at as we move through. In terms of forecast mineral requirements, so we saw the growth a couple of slides back about EV growth. What does this mean, though, in terms of mineral growth? The chart there on the slide identifies the main minerals that we expect to grow will be in the lithium ion battery, and how we think that might go through for predicted demand with no technology changes by 2030. And you can see some massive growth, copper, aluminium, graphite, some big numbers there. But actually, we already have massive markets of copper, aluminium and graphite, and the increased demand is going to be really quite minor in the context of our existing global supply chain. But for lithium and cobalt, by 2025, EV batteries, if we see the growth we're looking at on that graph, could account for 75% of lithium production and 65% of cobalt. And just to put that in some physical numbers, global production of lithium in 2016 was around 35,000 tons. We expect it could be by 2050 up to 2 million tons globally mined of lithium. And for cobalt, a similar extent of change from about 130,000 thousand tons in 2016 to maybe 5 or 6 million tons. So massive change in the growth of the mineral demands of these two minerals in particular. And then that is, because of that, those were the key ones that we looked at in this research report to see where they were currently mined, what were the impacts happening, and just thinking through maybe where forecast growth might occur as well with new reserves. But just before we move on to that, just want to think through another challenge, if you like, that this move to this new technology is creating, which is one of, it's a brand new supply chain. So you're looking here on the screen, you've got the raw material extraction, material processing, manufacture, battery use, and end of life. Well, the LSM, the large scale miners, and the artisanal miners, and we'll talk a bit about artisanal mining shortly, for lithium and cobalt, hasn't previously been in the supply chain of batteries to the extent it will be for EVs, but in particular for car manufacturers. So we're going to see a huge change, a huge growth in a brand new supply chain, which then brings its own challenges because you've got a number of actors connecting and working together who necessarily haven't connected and worked together before, don't necessarily have principles of working in place, etc., etc. The other point on this supply chain is, on this supply chain diagram, is the secondary material extraction. And, you know, at the moment, there isn't much of a secondary material extraction for either lithium or cobalt. Lithium has a big use already in rechargeable batteries for mobile phones, laptops, obviously also a growth market. It's also in some non-rechargeable batteries for things like toys and clocks. There's actually a big barrier at the moment for lithium recovery, as currently it's cheaper just to mine it in virgin form than recover it from existing technologies and from obsolete batteries we might have. Cobalt compounds are also used as catalyst in chemical manufacture, scrap alloys, and in some instances, actually, concentrations in scrap is higher than in the original ore. So there's opportunities for recovery for many purposes, but for many uses, if you like. But at the moment, that infrastructure doesn't exist and isn't in place. And I also read a report quite recently that identified that if we extracted cobalt from faulty lithium-ion batteries from our home electronics, that could be about 4,000 tons of cobalt, which probably equaled the amount in EVs on the road in 2017. So there's already a lot out there, but the demand and the infrastructure isn't there for that secondary material extraction. But I think it's something that really needs to get in place very quickly as the growth in EV really starts to accelerate. So in terms of what are some of the impacts we're expecting to be seeing, what are the environmental and social impacts with this supply chain? Raw material extraction, we've spoken about. For many of you, these are probably going to be some fairly common technologies: ore mining, open cast, underground mines. But there's also some unique aspects of raw material extraction for lithium. There's a brine method, pump water, lithium brine from underground, evaporate it in ponds and concentrate up the lithium salts in that way. Also investigation currently happening on taking lithium from seawater, which would clearly seem to be like a good outcome as well. And the one thing I also mentioned earlier, cobalt, a lot of cobalt is also coming from artisanal mining. So it's really small scale individuals doing that mining. And in fact, actually, artisanal mining is the second, if it was a country itself, it would be the second largest producer of cobalt behind large scale mining in DRC. So massive amount of artisanal mining, which just creates a different challenge with managing social and environmental impacts there. For lithium, where do we get it from? As clearly environmental and social impacts are heavily driven by the countries it's coming from. So lithium, global production at the moment is primarily South America, North America, Australia and China. Increasing demand is prompting exploration in some places maybe closer to home for us, Portugal. And also there's some discussion about whether we could open some of the old mines in the former tin mining areas of Cornwall. But if you look at mining claims, those applied for and granted, as an indication of short-term expansion, lithium claims are in countries, Australia, Finland, and Southern Africa, as well as South America, in an area known as the lithium triangle, so the borderlands of Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. And reserves, we're really looking at longer term exploration, the long term growth, really looking at that lithium triangle. And then Cuba seems to have a lot of reserves, but not much extraction at the moment. So maybe that might come to play. Then in terms of cobalt, 60% of cobalt currently comes from the DRC. So there is also mining in Canada, Russia, and Australia. But predominantly that's large scale mining. The DRC has a significant amount, as we've talked about, of artisanal mining, as well as some large scale mining. And I think we're looking, if you look at some of the future expansion, short-term growth, looking at where mining claims are already in place for cobalt, it's Zambia, DRC, some in Madagascar again. Again, some countries with some very high instances of artisanal mining. Longer term, it's DRC and Australia again. So you're starting to see that the countries, generally the countries where we've already got extraction of lithium and cobalt, are likely to be the countries that are going to see this significant growth, because that's where our reserves are. So it's really makes sense then to understand what are the environmental and social impacts happening in those countries, and then just start to think to ourselves what the potential implication of growth might be. In terms of, as part of the work we did, we actually mapped some of the environmental sensitivity and social context of the countries with either the permitted areas for mining, the claims for mining, to see where there was significant overlap in environmentally sensitive locations or social context. And the biggest issue the biggest overlap really came up in the lithium triangle. So those parts of the borderlands of Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, where there's a lot of sensitivity and a lot of mining growth, and we're going to see a lot of growth in there in the future as well. So what do we mean by the environmental impacts of mining? Probably not going to dwell on some of these drastically, because I think a lot of these are those we'd expect from mining, that it's visual, it's land-based, open cast, underground might be less hidden, but no less significant. You've got the dust, the noise, the vibrations, heavy machinery, as well as ecological and water table changes. I think if you can, looking specifically about some examples though, and the list continues here. A large mine in Zambia is actually producing a huge amount of copper and cobalt, which often come together. Open cast and underground mining, pollution of a local stream from acid waste has caused a lot of fish deaths, ground contamination, bioaccumulation of cobalt and copper in the affected sediments. So that's having a massive impact in that local area, and it's probably going to see a lot more. As we say, there's a lot of growth in Zambia expected for cobalt in the future. There's also been a lot of examples of PAD, so protected area downgrading, downsizing and degazettement, and enhanced a bit, unfortunately, by political pressure and corruption. And an example of this, looking at WWF's PAD tracker, is that in Zambia, which is one of the big producers of cobalt, there have been 33 PAD events, 20 of which have been associated with mining. So just shows that we might consider that environmental protected area means that that area is going to be protected, but pressures on the ground and pressures in country economic development can cause some of these things to change. So isn't necessarily as secure as we might hope. And I think for the artisanal mining, yes, they might be locally small, but the scale of them, if you remember, we said that artisanal mining in DRC could be, if considered to be a nation in its own right, would be the second biggest nation for cobalt mining. Therefore, they have significant impacts. They aren't affected by regulation. And some of the education of artisanal miners means that some really environmentally damaging processes are being employed. Specific to lithium, the brine extraction maybe is an area of unique methods that we spoke about. It does have significant implications for groundwater reserves, underground hydrology, even after mining stops, unfortunately, through the pollution and depletion of water reserves. Lithium brines tend to be located in arid environments, so water resources are scarce, the local ecosystems are very fragile, meaning they're a lot more susceptible to change. An example which might explain one of the pictures on the slide you're looking at is the wetlands of the Atacama Desert is a source of lithium brine, and migratory birds, including the Andean flamingo. It's actually classed as vulnerable on the red list. There's evidence lagoons and meadows in the sea flats are shrinking, and the Chilean Forestry Commission has recorded a drop in flamingo population, and which they have directly linked to mining in the area. So there are some general mining impacts, but also some specific examples of where cobalt and lithium mining is actually having a direct effect on areas we would consider to be environmentally protected. So moving on, I guess get my slides to move on. So social impacts. I've just moved 2 slides. Let's go back. Processing. I think the impacts of processing are fairly well documented. I'm not sure there's much that's unique to lithium or cobalt here. Some of the process technologies would be gravity separation, fairly simple, but you've also got water, chemicals, and therefore some acidification. So probably not a huge amount unique, but it's your normal dust, your heavy machinery, and then also bioaccumulation of contaminants, which can occur in the processing as well. Moving on to some of the social context. Large scale mining, we sort of split the social context in the work we did looking at large scale and artisanal mining. So if we just focus on large scale mining to start with, as with the environmental impacts, the magnitude of the impact is clearly dependent on the sensitivity and the risk of the location. So as part of the research, we had a look at the top cobalt and lithium producing countries and also where the sizable reserves were located, where those were different. And for each of them, looked at performance against a selected number of development indicators around social context. So the Corruption Perception Index, Global Terrorism, Voluntary Principles, Human Rights Index. And the majority of the countries we're looking at with large-scale mining had not signed up to the Voluntary Principles for Security and Human Rights, nor do they require companies to disclose contract transparency agreements. So clearly showing there some concerns in that social context of which the operators would be working in, with particular concerns being identified if you look at the ratings in those indices for China, Africa, particularly DRC, and some of the South American countries, in terms of those countries which are significant for cobalt and lithium. And based on those main producing countries, we look at the sort of large scale mining, the issues we're talking about there on the slide. So encroachment of land with indigenous people, particularly prevalent in lithium triangle. So in South America, lithium triangle for lithium, and Brazil for cobalt. So seeing a lot of impacts there in terms of indigenous people's lands. Land grabbing and resettlement can also be a very big issue, and particularly in Africa. So coming back, there may be the DRC and Zambia. 90% of Africa's rural land is undocumented. So, and that obviously leaves rural communities very vulnerable to that land grabbing around major development. It's fair to say that a lot of large-scale mining companies have really strict policies, really large programs around social engagement, social performance, but we still see on the ground poor labour and working conditions in cobalt and lithium mines. The community health impacts we've got there on the screen as well. We've looked at the contamination of air and water, water depletion, on the previous slides, thinking about it as an environmental impact, but clearly those environmental impacts will also have an impact on community health where they're local communities, and that's the local worker communities as well. And finally, the corruption and national governance can actually affect the ability of large-scale mining companies to contribute positively to economic development and deliver on some of their corporate level programs. So some real significant issues from a large-scale mining perspective from social, and consider also in terms of artisanal mining. Similar, there's a lot of social impacts. Child and forced labour is well documented across a range of mining activities in the copper and cobalt artisanal mining in particular. Zambia, Philippines, DRC, which is clearly keeps coming up as being a major source of cobalt, both currently and increasingly in the future. We've got the armed conflicts, and non-state armed forces are getting involved in illegal control of mine and of transport. So a lot of issues being raised by OECD, private security forces, using force to penalise trespassers. There's also evidence and reports of illegal selling of minerals. So that some controls have been put in by certain companies in the automotive supply chain, saying that the way they're going to control responsible sourcing of, say, cobalt, is it not going to source cobalt from DRC? But there are reports that DRC produced cobalt is being smuggled into Zambia and then sold as Zambian cobalt. So by putting in place some certain restrictions, it's causing other things to happen. And the final thing from artisanal mining to raise is probably about the health and safety risks. These are very small players, clearly, and lack of PPE, exposure to toxic metals, and that is not only adults, but also children. So huge amount of issues happening there in the sort of small scale artisanal mining, really affecting. And I think it's, these are effects happening, existing cobalt and lithium mining, both from a social and an environmental perspective. And if you think back to the scale of growth we were talking about, really starting to see EVs being responsible for 75 and 65% of cobalt and lithium mining, we're just going to see an increase unless we can get greater control on these impacts. We're just going to see a real increase in the on-the-ground environmental and social impacts being caused. So before we move on to talk about some of the controls in place, Lucy, do you want to publish the poll, please, the next poll? Thank you. So now you've had some understanding in a very quick approach of the environmental and social impacts that could be caused. Will that impact change your decisions or behaviour? Be interesting to get your thoughts on whether that's going to change how you might consider buying an EV. So while you're thinking about that change, we'll start to move on and think about the existing controls that could be in place. There's no time in this short presentation to go through all the existing controls you could put in place for all the many different environmental and social impacts I've raised. But I think it's worth looking at a holistic level, that there are some really important controls in place already, and also some that are emerging. So those are maybe that are in place already, exist around those around conditions for mining developments, whether that be EIA, social impact assessment, environmental social impact assessment, clearly required globally, but they're not universally applied. The different, very significant level of detail and rigor being applied by country. And I think it's also fair to say that, these apply for large-scale mining activities, but they don't apply to the artisanal mining, which, as we keep coming back to, is a significant impact for cobalt. There's also a lot of guidance and standards that are being developed, and just two on the screen there. The ICMM, which brings together 27 mining companies, over 30 regional commodities, have a very strong program requiring all their members to obtain third-party assurance on sustainability performance, 10 principles and environmental and social issues its members must adhere to. So some really strong programs in place. IFC, any of you involved in EIA work, significant environmental and social performance standards that are required to be implemented and managed where all external international lending happens. So there are some really strong programs, some really strong controls, and yet we're still seeing the impacts we've already spoken about happening on the ground in the countries that are affected and that are core countries for cobalt and lithium. There is regulation and policy to national level in pretty much all of those countries as well, but I think it's fair to say, and we all probably have experience of this in many different countries we've worked in, that level of governance and permitting and enforcement infrastructure does vary by country. And there's been, that's where we need to look to private industry to follow the international standards that apply rather than working to local national legislation. And NGOs have a really important role to raise awareness and build capacity with communities, and to get some of that accountability working as well. Artisanal mining and small scale mining, it's under-regulated. Clearly, it's recognised and legal in DRC, but it's also the ability and capacity to regulate is under-resourced. Level of awareness and understanding of the legal conditions is quite low. Regulations are seldom followed. So there are some changes that people are trying to put in place, but clearly we have this policy landscape exists, and coming back to it, the impacts we've spoken about are still happening. An area of change potentially that is maybe more evolving is, if you like, setting standards within supply chains. There's one that might have been coming to some of you, the conflict minerals legislation that does exist, in particular across the EU. China and the US also have very strong conflict mineral legislation and requirements, requiring importers to carry out due diligence on supply chain, for companies to be transparent about where they've got conflict minerals from. In the US, that includes in your annual report. However, that only covers tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. Lithium and cobalt are currently not classified. There has been for many years a push to have them added to that conflict mineral legislation, as that has started to see a change in the 4 minerals affected. And in particular, it would be great to see that for cobalt, given the focus. There are also, though, wider supply chain programs that have evolved and are growing. But I suppose there's, as we've looked about with the growth we're expecting to see in cobalt and lithium, there's some big growth that maybe needs to happen. So just to name a few, and apologies if anyone listening today is linked to some I haven't got on the screen. The Responsible Cobalt Initiative was established a couple of years ago to tackle risks, particularly around child labour in cobalt mining in the DRC. Responsible Battery Coalition is really looking to advance responsible production and also reuse, recycling and resource recovery, as we've spoken about. If we could start getting that secondary market going, then we could reduce the virgin extraction. I still think we'll need a lot of virgin extraction to create the demand, but clearly there's some opportunities there. Responsible Minerals Initiative, similar, has tools and resources to make sourcing decisions that could be improving regulatory compliance and responsible sourcing. So a number of supply chain programs currently evolving and being developed as well in the existing policy landscape. The final thing we then looked at in our research project was around, well, if we look at these policies that are in place, what are some of the additional measures that could happen and maybe be developed alongside the growth of the new supply chain, as clearly it's going to be easier to develop some of these controls as a supply chain develops and evolves, rather than trying to put it in place in a very mature supply chain. So we just talk through. So possible actions here. I think a key one for me is strong reuse and recycling infrastructure. So, it's clear, we've spoken about that we're going to see a massive evolution in the amount of lithium and cobalt needed, and other minerals as other technology develops for batteries. Capacity of an EV battery tends to drop beneath 70 to 80% in just 10 years of use, and then it's ineffective for use in a vehicle. But research has actually identified that those batteries are no longer effective for EVs could actually be used for stationary energy storage. So they could be modified and then maybe used to store solar energy, maybe in domestic circumstances. So we could be looking to repurpose the EV batteries where slightly different power to weight ratio isn't going to be as significant. But also we could actually have pressure to increase recycling rates. Can we get recycling of EV batteries? Can we get enough infrastructure put in place to enable recycling to occur of the minerals in the batteries? And one measure we identified, as well as really needing the repurposing of the retired lithium-ion batteries, getting some recycling infrastructure and the economics and the markets for those to grow, really, one thing that we could do now as batteries are developed is having clear and accurate labeling of batteries. What are the minerals in it? So that come the times the secondary market's in place, that we actually know what's in the batteries that we're then looking to recycle in 8, 10, 15 years time. As otherwise trying to then unpick it will make the economics a lot harder. So that was one, a coordinating body. Clearly with all the different bodies in this place, and also national legislation and national governance and national implementation, having a single policy landscape with all-encompassing set of performance expectations across the whole battery chain, so across the new actors working together. And during the research, we actually identified that there had been a very strong program developed by the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative a few years ago that really looked to set what are the expectations and commitments for a new aluminium supply chain. So there are clear initiatives that could exist that could provide a coordinating body around responsible sourcing in that supply chain, and to help support increased governance and regulation in country. And the final one of the possible measures really want to identify, maybe before we move to questions and see the outcomes from the polls, would be communication to end users. So for one, I think it's really important. We've seen the change, that public change, public demand can raise around climate change. And I think the more that final consumers and customers, the automotive industry, we can really get some communication going around the implications of the increased minerals and the social and environmental impacts, I think could really start to change and force change within the industry. The final one would just be research and development. Can we get more minerals out? Can we be having different mineral technologies? And obviously some of those things will continue to change. So lots of actions can be done. And I really think, I guess my plea on this presentation is for us all, when starting to go and looking to buy EVs, when working, is really to start to ask the questions. Can we start to create a drive towards responsible sourcing, certifications that maybe could really start to make a change in this industry? So final poll is, if there was some form of sustainable battery, cobalt lithium certification, maybe similar to Forest Stewardship Council, Marine Stewardship Council, would that change your decision making? Would it make a difference for you when trying to buy your EV? Lucy, do you want to start looking at the questions we've got?
We've got lots and lots of questions.
Great, thank you. I won't promise to be able to answer them all.
I'll just mention that any questions that we don't manage to answer today, we will try and answer afterwards. We'll combine those with the list of questions that we had from Luke's presentation last week and provide some feedback afterwards. So I'll start. We've got a question about, it's a comment and a question. So it says, forests and soil and lands in my part of India are being deforested for these sustainable minerals for a Green New Deal, conflated with human and environmental rights abuses. How is this sustainable in any form when EV cars are being sold as green?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things that I feel that we need to be very clear, that an EV is a low carbon. Now, if there's forest deforestation happening, then you'd need to have a look across the whole chain. But that's one of the things I've been particularly keen that we need to understand what EVs are. They are decreasing the climate impact of driving, but they're not zero social and environmental impact, far from it. And I think it's really important. I've seen a lot of people saying, I'm going to EVs, I don't have impacts, I don't have environmental impacts. Like, well, you don't, you're causing some different ones. And I think, it's really important that people understand what they are buying and what they're not.
Thank you for that. We've got another question that's slightly, you might not be able to cover this answer, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the effect of tyre particulates which may increase with heavier EVs on local emissions?
Yeah, that's not one I don't know the answer of, but it's definitely something we can ask some of our air quality guys, and we can get back in. I think you'd said, Lucy, we're not necessarily going to answer. We won't get to all questions, but questions we will try and answer and see whether we can produce a document after this session that wraps up questions that were asked of Luke and myself. So let us investigate that and see whether we can see what the outcome is of that. I definitely have heard that. I have seen articles saying that people who are moving to EVs are moving to larger EVs rather than the smaller ICEs they might have previously had. So that's probably an unintended consequence as well.
I've got another question about battery technology. Can other battery technologies be promoted to EV manufacturers, such as sodium batteries?
I think there is a huge evolution in battery technologies. And I think even things like fuel cells are going to change the size of the battery we need as well. So in focusing on the lithium cobalt in the research and study we looked at, we're clearly just looking at one aspect that's probably going to evolve considerably. So we could, but I think we also need to make sure that those battery technologies are going to give the right power to weight ratio and therefore give the effectiveness that us as users in terms of speed of charging, distancing, and some of the other issues that Luke spoke about last week about how we charge and how we use our EVs and how far we go. So there's lots of trade-offs. And I think this is not a space that we've got to the end of the technology, far from it.
Okay, and this probably is related to the certification. We've got a question. Do you think there will be some kind of fair trade label for batteries in the future?
I would love there to be. I'm going to say yes. I think they can, and I think there should be. And I also think the automotive sector as a whole has shown over many years how it's really able to drive supply chain procurement programs and make a change in environmental practices in their supply chains. So with some of the initiatives coming out of the Responsible Battery Coalition, etc., I think that there would be a big appetite for that. So I would like to think so, and I think that's something that we can all put public pressure on as well, by asking questions when looking at what EVs we might want to go for.
Okay, we've got another question. Has there been an analysis of the environmental impacts of battery production against the existing mineral mining processes needed for manufacturing ICEs?
Not that I've done, and I think it was one of the things I was going to say at the beginning, but you never quite say everything you plan, do you, when you're preparing for a session like this? Was actually going to say that, we're not saying that there aren't environmental and social impacts with current manufacture of ICEs, nor even the extraction of oil. But that doesn't mean that we should only be looking for our new technologies to be as good or as bad as our current, particularly given back to maybe the first question, Lucy, that you asked, which was, how can you say this is a green technology? So, yeah, I think we need to try and get the social and environmental impacts as low as we can anyway. Just because it's better than before doesn't necessarily mean it's as good as it could be. Particularly, I think the concentrating of the impacts we're going to see in certain countries, the lithium triangle, DRC, Zambia. There are a few countries that are going to be really concentrated because of the mineral reserves, if it remains lithium and cobalt.
Okay, we've got lots more questions, but do we want to have a look at the poll results?
Yes, I can't see the poll results, Lucy. I don't know why, but I can't see them on my screen. So I don't know whether you're able to talk through the poll results.
Yep.
Sorry.
That's fine. So question one was, what type of vehicle do you own? And 52% had petrol, diesel, but thinking of changing to EV soon. 23% petrol or diesel, but don't want to change to EV. And then 18% of people don't own a vehicle. And then
higher than last week.
Yep. And then the other options, we've got no one that's got an LPG. We've got 3% with full electric and 4% with hybrid. So not particularly unexpected and very similar to last week, I think.
Yep.
And the next one was, what would be the most important positive factor in your decision to buy an EV? And we've got 54% making a positive contribution to climate change. Next is 24% cost of operation, fuel maintenance, road tax and insurance. Yeah. And then 11% making a positive contribution to air quality, 6% other reason, and 4% I wouldn't buy an EV.
Okay. And then what about poll 3? Has the presentation changed people's thoughts?
Yeah, so the question 3 was, now you know the impact, will this change your decisions/behaviour? And 41% said yes, might change the time period before buying an EV to see if responsible batteries are developed. And then next up, 32% no, but I will be including responsible sourcing as a criteria during selection and purchase. And then yes, might reduce my likelihood of buying an EV. That was 15%.
That wasn't the intention. Sorry, guys.
No was 10% and 2%. I wouldn't buy an EV anyway.
Okay.
And then the last poll was, would sustainable batteries or cobalt lithium certification affect your decision making? And we had 71% said yes, and I would even pay a slight/marginal premium. 23% yes if no implication for cost or model, and 5% no. So that was quite clear on that one.
Yeah, so everybody needs to be pushing for and encouraging and creating a global ask for some form of responsible battery, responsible mineral certification in this space. So yes.
Okay, so I think we're just about out of time for the questions and the polls. Just want to say thank you very much, Sally. I've certainly learned a lot today from the subject. And just want to say that the webinar has been recorded and will be available on YouTube soon. And also watch out for the next MPA Sustainability Ambassador webinar mini-series coming soon at majorprojects.org.uk/events. And also I'd like to mention that MPA members can also register for a half-day Climate and Sustainability Delivering Net Zero seminar taking place on the 21st of April. And that's a morning session, 9 a.m. till 1 p.m. GMT. And AECOM's Chris White will be presenting on Natural Capital Laboratory amongst other speakers. I'll quickly hand over to Andy, who will speak about some other MPA events coming soon. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lucy, for chairing these pair of events. They've been really, really fascinating, and thank you to Sally for speaking today and Luke previously. I think just highlights really the title of today's session, isn't it? The hidden costs, and you mentioned as well the unintended costs as well. It's something I think we're going to be looking at as an association through our Sustainability Ambassadors Network. You know, these trade-offs and dilemmas that we need to address, both as consumers and also as project professionals. So I'd just like to wrap up in terms of signposting some future events. So tomorrow we have a half-day seminar on productivity, and I think there's still a few spaces left for that. If you're able to register, please do so. And then that's followed a week later with Cuba Work, which is an immersive sort of networking environment in a sort of Second Life format, where your avatar will mingle with other avatars, and the topic for that session is planning in an uncertain world. So it's a very topical discussion will be had for that session. That one's open to non-members too, so if you're interested, please do go to our website and register. Then we have some professional development activity, which is our major project simulator. So it takes you through the full life cycle of a project, from concept through to post-project benefits. And that's the 3rd of March. And then our next seminar, 2 pairs of seminars coming up, one on 17th of March on benchmarking, looking at how organisations can benchmark their major projects cross-sector as well, so within sectors and cross-sectors, and then followed by one looking at procurement, so more about sort of reimagining procurement on that one in light of particularly the UK's new trading relationship with the EU and the rest of the world. So looking at opportunities around new legislation and new approaches for procurement. And Lucy's already given a good plug to our session in April for our Delivering Net Zero half-day seminar, which is more on sort of conference style. So thanks very much for that, Lucy. Last thing I'd like to do is to remind you that you'll have a feedback request coming your way into your inboxes. So you can also see the code on the screen here, so please do give us feedback on these webinars so that we can apply your feedback to future sessions that we're going to host. Once again, thank you to AECOM for putting on these pair of events.